the last chunk that you wrote and how that was sort of woven through, or that was, I'm just curious about, were you writing those like interspersed with the narrative, or was that like a different chunk of your writing that you did that you then put in? Or?
Yeah, I mean, they kind of sprung up organically because the book's in present tense, and there's kind of a lot of drama going on because it's an EMT's life, and it can start feeling claustrophobic. So I think it was a way, as I was writing, I was like, I really need a break, and if I need a break, the reader probably does too. So it was kind of this way to stay in line with what was happening, but also just kind of step out of the frame a little bit. And then as I went along, it got a little bit more, it sort of took a little more, like the amount of research that I did to try to write each tiny little section kept expanding, and how do I cram all this stuff that I find interesting into this tiny little section. So at some point it became like its own separate project almost.
Which organ was the most interesting to you personally?
Oh, Vision was pretty cool. I mean, that's not an organ, but like, when I started researching eyes and just how that works, that I learned a lot. That was really surprising to me. And then it worked out because I saw my ophthalmologist, and I said I had like a checklist of questions. I'm like, so is it true to say that, you know, this is kind of how the eyes work, and is this a fair statement? And she had no idea of why I was asking her. But she was great and just kind of answered the questions. But she never was like, why are you asking about that? About what shape that part is, anyway.
The book is mostly written in first-person present tense. I was kind of wondering if you experimented with any other POVs or tenses when you were writing it, and what made you decide that first-person present tense is how it needed to be told?
I mean, I think that was like the natural place for me to start, and then because it was in my grad program, I got forced to write it in other ways and see how that felt. And it was really nice to play with third-person point of view, and there was kind of a lot. It's sort of more comfortable, I think, as a writer to be like, oh, I'm over here, and I can just say what's happening to this person, as opposed to constantly trying to jump into this brain and live it with them. And present tense does that too. But it's also just so much more immediate, which felt right. Like I wanted the reader to feel like they're on the ambulance. And so that's what kind of ended up making that decision.
How many drafts of your novel did you go through before it was published?
I mean, I think I turned in draft number 9 to the publishing house, and then I basically lost track of how many more drafts there have been since then. At least 70. Yeah.
Did you go on an ambulance?
Oh, yeah, I worked as an EMT for 3 years.
Wow.
So. Yeah. Yeah, so that was something I didn't have to do too much research on, because I had like way more stories than I could possibly put in this book, so it helped.
When you were a driver, were you cataloging those stories and doing writing about them, and just trying to keep track of some of those stories? When you were a driver, were you keeping some sort of a journal, or was it all just locked away in memory?
I mean, I started writing some short stories that made their way into here, but they were kind of always in a short story form, as opposed to, I didn't journal too much about it because I just found that I didn't really release anything from me somehow. It almost made it tighter. And then at some point when I was like, okay, I want to write a book, I tried to make a list of like every interesting call I'd ever gone on, which was quite a week. But that didn't work either. And I don't know, there was something about it where it's like, I don't know, there's something about just trying to write the story itself, but then things would spring up and then you have an easier time remembering it, as opposed to somehow stream of consciousness didn't work, and trying to make a list didn't work, and I tried a lot of different things. Yeah.
So I guess kind of piggybacking on that question, so then the writing of the narrative brought up memories of some stuff that you may have forgotten about? Or
Yeah,
not forgotten
definitely.
about, but like it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's sort of the funny thing. If somebody asks you to tell an interesting story about being an EMT, like my mind goes completely blank. I'm like, I don't know. But if the other day you're hanging out with this one and she's like, okay, so if there's a pneumothorax and this is happening, and you're like, oh, one time there was this crazy sucking chest wound. You know, so it's just, if there's like a prompt in some way, then I kind of can get the conversation going, which is also what's sort of interesting about hanging out with EMTs, I think, is like the way the stories just start to spiral and spiral and spiral, and it can just go on for hours because it's not what you're actively thinking about, but then something about it just like opens the floodgates, you know.
I have another one. It's after that too. Did that help your chapter on memory? Did you gain any insight on that in your chapter on memory?
Man. So memory was like the hardest thing in the whole world. Like I interviewed 4 different doctors and scientists about memory, and I tried to do all this research. And there was this particular thing I really wanted to write about, and I basically got told by somebody whether. He was so great. I mean, he was very patient with me. I'm sure my questions were like horrendously amateur. But at some point he was like, you're basically asking about the fundamental question of our time. All right, I'm sorry. I guess the research isn't there yet. You know? I'm sorry. And it's also like, what research is there? Some of it is kind of at war with itself in terms of which theory is, you know, the most agreed upon or has the most data to prove it or anything like that. So that was tough because I really wanted to put more of that in there. And then at some point I ended up switching and talking about somatic memory instead, which is really interesting. But it's this idea of like if you have certain triggers. I mean, we've all had that. Really, you smell something and then you have this distinct memory, or you hear a song and you're like sitting in a certain chair all of a sudden again, or you just like the whole experience comes back somehow because of one kind of trigger. So I ended up writing about that kind of memory instead, because it's just a little bit less argued about. There's not that much data on that kind of memory either, but at least it wasn't this total shutdown. It's like, stop it, you know. Yeah.
Which one?
Hi.
Were we on? Me?
Go ahead.
Here we go.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi, Bridget.
So when, thank you for reading, and nice to see you. So when kind of developing the character of Piper, now that I've gotten a few more pieces, one of the things that I wanted to know is, do you suppose the character Piper was sort of fated to become an EMT? You know, supposing that you as the author believe in something of that, or do you think it's something that just happened to her? And did that perhaps change during your writing of the book?
That's a great question. And now I'm suddenly self-conscious, and maybe I didn't think enough about that. I mean, I think I did spend some time trying to figure out, well, what is her reason for becoming an EMT? But in the end, it sort of felt like in her very Piper way, it was actually almost arbitrary. But like she needed a change. She wanted to feel capable. She wanted to feel like she had some control over her floppy life, and that was the thing that she chose. So it was kind of arbitrary, maybe because the author told her to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think she could have made another decision too, but it was more just about that feeling of like, I need to do something different.
So the little asides about the body, in addition to being a break, do they also serve as transitions? Are they relevant to what comes before and after them in terms of Piper's development?
Yeah, they're completely, I mean, the placement of them had everything to do with that, and also trying to find an arc in the inner chapters, or sorry, I call them the inner chapters, the little vignettes about the body. So they kind of have their own arc and their own much more abstract story than everything else. But then where they're placed in the book have a lot to do with Piper, like what she's seeing, what she's remembering. You know, the one about the lungs is almost about like sound and what she's hearing. It comes right after a chapter where she's spent the whole day in the ambulance. She's super conscious of all the sounds on it. So yeah, they're tiny.
Do you feel any obligation to change like the details of your calls, or like just I don't know, I remember when you were working on it, you were sometimes concerned about like revealing like too much of an actual case. So was there any sort of process in switching it up, or you just like pick a different limb and
Well, I have a pretty bad memory about like which one was it a little bit, so that wasn't too hard. But at some point, I think what made me feel a little bit more comfortable in the end, I didn't want to implicate like the fire department I used to work with, the ambulance company I used to work for. I didn't want to give any of that away or have it be too obvious. So I ended up doing some work to try to come up with a fake district, basically. So even though it covers some of the same neighborhoods I used to work in, it does it in such a way where like that district doesn't exist, that fire department doesn't exist, that ambulance company doesn't exist. So between that and then between like, how did anyone write a book before Google Maps and being able to like see images and be like, okay, I gotta make sure no one actually lives in a brown house at this intersection or whatever. So that helped too.
I didn't want this to end before asking about Kyla, because I think she's such a fantastic character, and I'm curious how she came to you. I know that's a big question, but whatever you want to say about bringing her into the novel, like why you needed her or why she stuck around, or how you developed her over time.
Yeah. So I part of the way I got the idea for Ayla was that a friend of a friend, I hadn't met very many female veterans before, but I was at this event where I met a handful of female veterans, and one of them pretty clearly had PTSD for what little I know. Like it's not like I can diagnose it or anything, but it felt kind of clear to me. But she was also this super charismatic person and really just like filled the whole room in a particular way. I remember just being really struck by her and really like, wow, I've just never met anyone like that before. And that got me curious about female veterans in general. And this was kind of at a time before now they have a lot more coverage in the media, but at the time they didn't. So I was really trying to hunt for, there's like one book out there at the time about their experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I started doing that research and then started to get the idea of like, well, what if one character, which became Ayla, was somebody who's like kind of head on dealing with these things that she already knows what is going on in her life. And then there's Piper who's like kind of in denial, kind of trying to like hide from stuff a little bit, and what if we put the two of them together.
The bus scene, when Piper goes on the bus with the multiple casualties, was there ever a draft where when she looks over at the woman that it was Ayla and it wasn't just someone that looked like her?
I don't want to talk about it too much because I know there's people here who haven't read the book, so I'm gonna leave that. We'll just pretend we never asked that. One more. Yeah. Oh no, one more. One more. Is there one more question?
Oh, someone has a better one. They can go.
No spoilers.
My question is, we have a first-person present tense novel, so Piper's telling the story to someone. Who do you imagine she's kind of telling it to? I guess your imagined audience for the piece.
Yeah, I resist that. I have to say. I know that's something that is talked about in terms of narrators, whether it's like first person or third person or second person, that you should sort of have this idea in your head about who the narrator is talking to. And I have to say, like as a reader, I don't need that, and I definitely don't need the thing that I feel like does happen in a lot of books. Of here's this first person narrator, and then by the end of the book it's like, and now I will write my story, and it's the book that's in your hands, that kind of moment. I'm like, oh yeah, so I didn't think about that too much. I mean, I have some of a story around that with the inner chapters. Like I kind of think of that as being like a sort of future Piper talking to her past self a little bit in this other way, it's like her weird way of being like, it's gonna be okay. But I think with the actual first-person Piper, I'm totally happy to just kind of be like, here's the ride.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah, sure. We'll walk up there. Thank you so much.